There's been a lot of discussion about what is the root cause of inceldom and the overall male desperation in the millennial and zoomer dating and mating market. Most people gravitate towards the lookism, face an LMS, BlckPill worldview, but I think it's too simplistic to fully explain what's happening. Not only are we dealing with an explosion of inceldom across the West, but it's actually dramatically worsening as time goes by. That recent video of that woman trolling all of those men on Tinder, over 100 men, and then them staying there and competing for this one average-looking woman, is a singular event that kind of typifies what's going on in the West right now. And I think this goes further than just looks. I mean, I think we're dealing with a demographic issue as opposed to something socio-political or biological. And I think it really comes down to there being too many men competing for too few women. And the thing is, we don't have an issue like in China or in India where we have sex-selective abortion and men being excessively selected over women by their parents, resulting in a demographic imbalance. That's not what's happening. What I think is happening is that you're seeing an inversion of the population pyramid due to the aging population. One of the first proofs I have of this are the stats showing a stark difference in single men versus women when you compare them by age cohort. If you look at the share of U.S. adults who are single, which I'm going to pop up on the screen, you'll see that over 50% of young men are single between the ages of 18 and 29. Whereas for women, it's under 1/3, it's 32%. And you might think, well, perhaps this is because older men are poaching these younger women. You know how most of the MGTOWs cope about this, and they'll say, well, it's because all of these women are washed up, nobody actually wants them after 35. But if you look at the stats, that's not what we see. In fact, it's the other way around. Women are actually less likely to be single between the ages of 30 and 49 than they are to be single between the ages of 18 and 29. Whereas with men, what you see is men ages 30 to 49 are almost half as likely to be single as men ages 18 to 29. This isn't just an artifact of the differences in the dating and mating market, I think. Not alone. Because if you compare the next cohort up of men ages 50 to 64, 27% are also single, right? So that means the majority of men, 73%, are with someone. Whereas if you compare it to women, 50 to 64, it's 29% of women are single. That's almost identical. So if we consider that men almost universally tend to date women younger than themselves, typically from their age down to roughly about 5 years younger than them, you can show the rough dating pool for a man in a given age cohort using the population pyramids that are separated by 5-year blocks. What you do is you take the male bar. It's rather arbitrary where you start this. I typically start it at the age right before men start dying in significant numbers more than women, which is typically around the 70-year mark. And I overlay it on top of the female bar 5 years younger than them. And then you take the women or the men left over, whichever one is larger, and you subtract them from the same age male or female cohort, respectively. So in the case of a natural population pyramid, where each generation is in absolute numbers larger than the previous generation, you will have an excess of women in each population cohort. And you can take that excess of women and subtract them from the male population in their own age group. And then you take that group of men, subtracting the extra women from their own age group, and you overlay them onto the bar of women that are 5 years younger than them, and then you repeat the process. And eventually you'll find that you can create a kind of ratio, men that are competing for women 0 to 5 years younger than them. And it follows down, and it is essentially a pyramid scheme, if you think about it, because as long as you have a constantly growing population, you can offset extra women that are taken, for example, in a traditional society that has like polygamy, like a medieval Islamic society. You can actually account for those missing women by taking them from the next generation that comes down, because in absolute numbers, they're always going to have more women than men that are somewhat older than them that are competing for them. This is what you see in countries where there has been a reduced female population. You see an increase in the difference of average age of marriage between men and women. And the average age between the two spouses increases when there's a demographic issue, like there's not enough women. And as a result, you can actually offset that. And this is what I think is happening in sub-Saharan Africa, where there is still widely practiced polygamy. You have to explain why there's widely practiced polygamy, but you don't have constant uprisings and constant, chaos. I mean, these countries are not stable, I'm not saying that, but you don't see gender-based craziness like what we would expect, right? And I think this is because they have such a high birth rate that they can offset all those extra women being taken by the men that marry those extra wives, producing a large number of children, many of them female. And studies have also shown that the gender ratio at birth, which is typically about 1.05, that actually increases to about 1.08 when you have only one child. But each successive child that you have after one child, the ratio goes down, approaching 1-to-1. And I think this is also partly explaining the gender ratio problems in a lot of Western countries because of the declining birth rate. I think if you look at countries that have younger populations, that means that there's more younger women and there's less competition by older men for those women. You're going to have a better overall situation for men in general. So if you look at countries like the Philippines or various Latin American countries or other young countries that have a young population, you don't see the kind of problems that we're dealing with in the West in these countries. And I do believe that is entirely due to the demographic situation being far better, even in countries where sexual morality is not heavily policed. Like, for example, the Philippines is more conservative than Western countries, but it is not in any sort of absolute sense a conservative culture, right? Like, there's a lot of prostitution. If you're a Westerner, you can get a girlfriend and you can fornicate with her. It's not going to be a problem, right? However, you don't have all of these incel men running around complaining about the situation in the Philippines. And this is because it's such a young population that there's a lot of women to go around, right? So if you're being outcompeted for women in your own demographic, you can just look 5 years younger or a few years younger, and you will find that there's even more women than the men that are competing for them. And then it continues. As I said, it is something of a pyramid scheme where you have a young population and then you're able to perpetuate this by producing more children. And this isn't anything scientific, but it's more of a visual experiment to show a trend in the ratios of men to women that are being competed for. That's really what's important here. It's not the actual numbers. If we were to do this in like some kind of scientific level, there would be a much more clear gradient and slope. But I still think it's useful to explain a trend, right? Because as I said, if the average man is between 2 to 5 years older than the woman that he's pursuing, it makes perfect sense that an inverted population pyramid will increase the competition for women compared to vice versa. I mean, you can use basic logic to come to the same conclusion. You don't even need to have this visual representation. But I do think it's useful to demonstrate exactly how this trend over time has affected the dating and mating market in the United States. If you compare the United States just within the last 50 years, you can see that there is a significant difference in the ratios for the age of when men and women are supposed to be pairing off, between the ages of 18 and 35. You can see that the ratio is getting smaller and smaller. And what's most interesting is that this isn't taking into account the racial demographics and the racial changes. If you look at non-Hispanic whites, the population pyramid is almost inverted. It's almost upside down with a bulge of millennials in the middle. Whereas if you look at Hispanics, it is a much more natural shape. And what is very curious is that you are seeing a large number of specifically white men that are going after women of other races, whether we're talking Hispanic women or East Asian women, even black women to a certain extent, though that's still quite rare. But you do see this male-led push towards miscegenation. It's not just because, white women are difficult to deal with. There's just more of these women of these different races in the demographic pool that men have to choose from, right? And there's less competition for them because of the shape of their population pyramid. So like poaching Hispanic girls is, it's just a lot easier than having to compete for white girls, where there's so many more men of different age brackets, whether we're talking men in their 30s down to men in their 20s, who may have a lot more money than you, who may be better looking than you, taller than you, who knows? But they're all competing for this same smaller and increasingly shrinking pool of women. So therefore it's a lot easier just to go after women of a different race. And I think this is what's happening in the United States right now. And you can also see this if you look at the statistics concerning inceldom broken down by race. You can see that women of other races, their rate of celibacy has been going down steadily since pretty much the data has been collected, but especially since the 2010s. What's being measured here would be any woman that's not white and not black, essentially, is what's being measured by other here in this context. And you can see that men are actually going up parabolically, while the women are going steadily down to almost zero. They're now below white women and black women. And white men are also increasing parabolically, but it's at a much slower rate. And I believe this is because white men are supplementing the missing women with women of other races. And this is disproportionately affecting those men of those same races. Having a demographic imbalance due to this inverted population pyramid is not in and of itself going to cause things, but what it will do is it will massively exacerbate existing problems. In the United States, one of the biggest problems is that boomer men divorced their wives in their 20s and 30s and then remarried Generation X or younger boomer women who were on the receding end of the population pyramid. And this put additional pressure on Generation X men. And it is interesting that if you look at when geomaxing phenomenon started to grow and develop, and when it really took off was the 2000s, the early 2000s. And yes, a lot of it was boomer men going to like Southeast Asia and the Philippines and stuff, but a significant number of them were Generation X men that were doing this. And I have a feeling this migration push was significantly exacerbated by baby boomer men who were making far more money than Generation X men, cucking them and taking their women. I think that's essentially what happened to them. And with millennials, this trend continued, right? Because you have to find those missing women somewhere. So they would then dip into the next generation's dating pool, right? And from there, millennials are now starting to poach if they, it's getting very difficult now. We all know how difficult the dating market is, but millennial men are starting to poach in significant numbers Zoomer women. And the problem with Zoomer men and younger millennial men, the millennial men that are born from the 1990s and later, where they're part of the smaller third of that population bulge, they are in a situation where they have no one to choose from because there's no children being born because of how damaged the economy is, because of how bad things have gotten, like the relations between the sexes, because of how pessimistic people are towards having children, especially women, how anti-fertility women have become. Generation Alpha, which is the generation after Gen Z, there's hardly any of them. If you look at the statistics, there's hardly any of them. They're just not being born. And the worst part about this is that this leads to a death spiral, because when you have fewer and fewer people being born in each successive generation, that means specifically fewer and fewer women being born. And women are the limiting factor when you are talking about population growth and fertility, right? So if you have fewer in absolute numbers, then you're going to have fewer children. Even if they, as a cohort, had more children, just due to the fact that there's less of them in absolute numbers, the overall population cohort that they will give birth to is going to be smaller. And this compounds on top of itself. So it becomes like a population death spiral. So it's very bad news, guys. Very bad news. Very pessimistic as far as the West goes, because we've had this situation for 50 plus years now, and it's not going to reverse itself. I think there was a chance for millennials to reverse it, but that has obviously been blown. The birth rate for them is catatonic. It's terrible. So This is just going to keep getting worse and worse, guys. And this is, as I said, this isn't necessarily causing things to happen directly, but it's exacerbating issues like feminism, simping, OnlyFans, hypergamy, all this shit. Like, all of this shit is feeding off of the demographic overlay that we're dealing with. If we had more women competing in the same market, you would be able to deal with issues like simping and hypergamy because you could just pick another woman, right? It's almost market forces at work, right? Supply and demand. Because the supply is lower and it's increasingly getting lower and lower, demand is rising, and these women can now make additional demands of their own, right? This is what is happening here. And this is also why I think women are totally blind to the situation, because you notice that they just don't care. They don't have any conception of the situation being terribly wrong the way that men do. And that's because they are the beneficiaries, the direct beneficiaries of the drought of women in the market. Like, if you're the one making money hand over fist in a deflating economy, you're not going to notice anything going wrong because your value, your stocks just keep going up. So it's really quite blackpilling, because I don't really see a way out of this, at least for the West. This is my thesis, that it's not just that there are more men than women, which is something that First talks about in his documentary, but I think we should dig into the specifics about it and make arguments based on this demographic data we have now and the statistical research that has been done on singles versus couples. And we can find what is going on. It's in the data here. I read an article I found from Inkwell Wiki called Men in Involuntary Inkweldom, written by Norwegian sexologist Kristin Spitsnagel. Most of the article isn't useful, but she did bring up a few important points I'd like to go over. So, with women's liberation came a dissolution of previous standards. Women can now support themselves and their possible children. They are no longer dependent on the resources men offer. This is only partly true. Women aren't dependent on male provisioning because we've taken on the enormous burden of employing and paying these women equally in the workforce. Through government handouts, affirmative action, and make-work jobs in the public and private sector. The disruption of productivity that happens when you bring a bunch of women into the workforce alongside men, or even just with each other, is so costly that we actually had to develop entire career paths for women, like human resources, in order to deal with these issues. And we also know that men are the only net taxpayers in the United States. Typically, men, as they approach middle age, start to be paying into the tax pool. And there's no reason to believe that this isn't the case in countries that have even more state-sponsored wealth redistribution, like Scandinavia. In a certain sense, you could argue that economic development is actually not a good thing, because eventually you reach a point where you can comfortably finance women's independence from male providers just through socialism. In Latin America, life without a man is extremely difficult by comparison. If you spend any time on dating apps in various Latin American countries, you're going to notice that women are very often eager to get married and pop out kids by the age of 20 to 22. This is because they spend like 2 to 4 years in the full-time workforce and realize how miserable life is without a man taking care of them in these countries. Cost of living is high, and there's no money in the economy to afford padding the job market and giving women advantages that would be too costly to bear for the economy. Another example of this, interestingly enough, is China. Entirely different culture, other side of the world. But one of the things that they've done with their version of feminism is they've given women equal rights and equal expectations identical to men. So it's not a situation like our weird hybrid of like patriarchal norms without any authority, like what we have in the West, where women are sort of coddled like they were in the patriarchal times, but without men having any authority. It's not that case in China. In China, it's completely rigidly economic and meritocratic. And as a result, what you see is the suicide rates in China between men and women are actually almost equal. And this is in spite of the fact that women, by and large, are benefiting massively from the gender ratio. Like, it hasn't come into full effect yet, as I've shown in my demographics video, but it is still favoring them to this point now. Like, we're starting to hear about these leftover men now, because it's about the time where they're going to start cropping up. So women actually have an advantage there in the mating and marriage market, but in spite of that, they still commit suicide on equal levels that men do. This is because they are given the same expectations as men, and they're not coddled. Moving on. Ergo, the bonds that have been placed on women's search for the best genes for their children are also released. Women are concerned with appearance, status, and capital, but studies show that they emphasize physical attractiveness far more than we may have previously thought. If you ask them, they may deny this, but this is just a reflection of political correctness. Studies show that women are in no way different from men. They want attractive partners, and now they are in a position to be more selective. They are just that. Again, this is true, but this has to be squared with the effect that ethnicity and social circle has on the dating and mating market. The main reason Mexicans are doing all right in the US, in fact better than every other group, is because they're geographically restricted to the south and southwestern USA, and they largely descend from low-skilled migrants, both legal and illegal, that cross the border in large numbers over the past 30 years. They've constantly supplemented their numbers with massive continuous migration from Mexico and Latin America. The main reason they've maintained their social circles and communities is that their migration was so rapid and so monolithic that they actually took over entire portions of the American Southwest demographically within a few decades. It is accurate to say that there are large stretches of the United States now that are 100% Mexican at this point. They might as well join Mexico based on the demographic situation there. Like, there are portions of the United States that are no longer recognizably American, except perhaps in economic terms. And this is a good thing, because American culture is probably the worst culture on earth when it comes to how we arrange our dating and mating situation. So anything is better than what we have now. And ironically, it would actually be to the advantage of inkwells, including like white inkwells, to have as much migration from Latin America as possible. Because if you can bring down the economic situation in the United States and bring the United States down to a poorer level through mass migration of workers without enough work to sustain them, you actually will benefit in the long run, because eventually we're going to run out of money to be able to finance things like affirmative action and make work jobs for women. And these companies will no longer be able to afford financing these women's positions. Or if they try to, they're going to have to cut from other areas. It'll make them less efficient. Over time, I think that would benefit us in the long run, because as the economy becomes weaker and people become poorer, women are going to have to become more reliant on men again. And this woman in this article, I think, recognizes this, but like most women, she's solipsistic. She doesn't see past, 10, 15 years. So we'll see how that ends up. Where a less physically attractive man who courted a woman could previously compensate by offering her a secure future, he now meets a woman with her own job, apartment, and resources enough to live out a thrill online. It's funny that there's this trend of 30-something millennial women now complaining about the lack of economically attractive men to marry in the middle to upper middle classes. I wonder if anyone's actually sat them down and just pointed out that bringing women into these middle and high-income jobs would by necessity push out men that would otherwise have worked in them. The economy isn't exactly a zero-sum game, but if we're talking middle to high-income jobs, they grow much more slowly than the amount of people that we've qualified for them since we've economically liberated women about 30 to 40 years ago. Right? And not only that, but we also promote them at the expense of the men that they would otherwise marry through affirmative action, both indirect and direct affirmative action. Because just because a company doesn't have an explicit affirmative action policy doesn't mean that they're not going to practice soft affirmative action just by considering female applicants before male applicants, just in the interest of promoting diversity for their own personal goals, rather than as a company policy per se. And furthermore, all my sisters are married to men who make less than them. And as a result, they're the ones who wear the pants in their relationships. And their marriages, as far as I can tell, they're not like bad marriages per se. They're just, it's not a natural arrangement, you can tell. All my sisters are mega helicopter moms. My nieces and nephews all grew up with a lot of sheltering, a lot of infantilization as a result of their mothers being the dominant force and just preventing them from taking any risks in life, Like, all of their social interactions were heavily curated by their parents. They weren't even allowed to splash in the pool, Like, it was that bad. I think that's what happens when women become the dominant partner in the relationship. You end up with that kind of infantilization. And this is, I think, what's hurt Zoomers a lot, too. Now, the Tinder section. Many single people use Tinder. This is one of the many dating apps that undoubtedly creates opportunities, but then perhaps most of all for the successful copies among us. For those who do not quite reach up in terms of appearance, status, and capital, it is rather more discouraging. As a cohabitation therapist, I would say that the gender market seems to be hardening. It is a cynical dog-eat-dog individualism that prevails. Everyone is looking for a better deal around the next turn. This applies to both women and men. I see it as part of the spirit of the times, and one may ask where we are going. In a lot of ways, the dating market and the economic situation are really mirrors of each other, because both have now transitioned from an in-person engagement where you would have a lot more nuance to how you would be getting a job, actually applying in person and presenting yourself as an employee, potential employee, instead of just writing out your resume on some paper and emailing it to be warehoused with hundreds of other applications. Instead of being able to at least get an initial consideration at face value, you're now having to be sifted through among hundreds of applicants where they can narrow out whatever they want or screen out whatever they want with a fine-tooth comb because they have so many applicants, because it's so much cheaper just in terms of social and time cost that it would take to apply in person versus just sending an application online. It's so much easier to do that than go in person, so they will just apply for hundreds of jobs instead of only applying for a set number of them that they could only physically be able to go to in order to give their applications in. And as a result, all these companies now have like the buffet choice of employees that they have now, and it's exactly identical to what online dating has done with dating markets, where now instead of at least getting an initial consideration, maybe you are a little on the short side, maybe you're not the most attractive person ever, but just being able to interact with somebody individually, other less concrete traits that you have, like whether we're talking personality or other things, who knows, your charisma, which I guess is personality. These factors could come into consideration even if you didn't have the looks to initially grab a girl's attention. But now, because they can filter everything out just with a swipe, right, or just setting their filters, you get wiped out before you even get a chance. And this is the same with the job market, because now that you have like hundreds of applicants per job, all right, it doesn't even matter whether they have an affirmative action policy or not, because they can still just screen out, for example, like all white males, let's say, or all straight white males they can screen out because they have, like, say, 400 applications and they just narrowed it down to 100 applications, Like, that's still a huge number of applications to sift through, so it doesn't even cost them anything. Because most likely there is going to be somebody who's like an Asian guy or a black woman or whatever, who has the same qualifications as you, among those 400 applicants to that job, right? So they can easily screen out and choose whoever they find both the most politically and economically convenient employee to give a job offer to. And finally, for the men going their own way community. These men believe that relationships, especially marriages, with modern women cost more than they taste, and therefore abstain completely. These men are also part of the mentioned manosphere online. The coping strategy here, however, is to take complete ownership in your own situation and refrain from everything that is about women, love, and children. The feeling of loneliness is solved with a kind, "If you do not want to play with me, I will not play with you" strategy. There may be a lot of self-empowerment in that kind of thing. Some voices have said that these men are not just going their own way, they are sent their own way, by women who choose them away. The thing that annoys me about MGTOWs is not the ideology itself, but the denial of reality they engage in. The whole red pill notion of game is cargo cult reasoning. They see attractive men pull women regardless of how they behave and infer that this is because they possess some kind of hidden psychological quality, like game or frame, instead of taking the Occam's razor approach and concluding that Jeremy Meeks type of guys are simply attractive enough that their behavior has little to no effect on their ability to attract women. Like Polynesian cargo cultists, they mimicked the external behaviors of Chad, believing they would get the same results. The consequence has been the disastrous PUA movement from the 2000s until now that probably greatly contributed to the sexual harassment hysteria that men have had to put up with in college and the corporate workplace. There's also the matter of sexual false consciousness, something that former TFL content creator VVS brought to our attention. Because there is this false impression that every man is successful in the dating market, there's this pressure to portray yourself as successful to other men in order to not feel humiliated or left out. This is why MGTOWs are all top-tier slayers making millions, but they have time to hunt down every feminist MSM article that comments on MGTOW or the manosphere, and bombard the comment section with hundreds of comments about how happy they are that they've deprived women of their affections. In conclusion, she called MGTOW exactly what it is, a cope. I actually like the frame of mind, but they need to accept the reality of the situation instead of pretending they are the prize. I wish it were true, but it's just not. The wall isn't exactly cope, but women's SMV doesn't actually drop significantly compared to men's. The problem is that women form their standards and expectations at the peak of their desirability and find it very hard to compromise as they age out of their prime years. So Becky might get like a Chad Light at 25 and a Normie at 35, but they aren't able to adjust their attraction downwards and therefore become Chad widows. By contrast, most men start at the bottom and either stay there or maybe increase slightly due to increasing money or status. We therefore have no issue adjusting our attraction downwards to whatever we can reasonably attain. So to summarize, this Norwegian woman did nail down some of the major problems we talk about, but this is also a cautionary tale. Some red pillers fantasize that if they pill their unicorn girl, she will suddenly understand her instincts and try to counteract or stop her worst tendencies. In my experience, women who are pilled will actually co-opt the evopsych arguments about hypergamy to justify their behavior towards sub-8 men. They will use this as a way of diverting responsibility for their actions to nature, making them even more toxic than if they had stuck to the egalitarian model for the relations between the sexes. That's it for now, guys. Like and subscribe if you agree, and let me know if you disagree in the comment section. Talk to you all later.